As you all by now know, I'm Corné and I'll be guiding you through my lunchtime talk under the title of The Evolutionary Mysteries of Sabah's Very Own Birdwing. And this talk is sort of a summary of a wider research project that I've been working on with Dr. Stephen and many other people around Sabah, but also in Europe. And it's based on two sort of chapters. And the first chapter is what I've been doing in the Netherlands, which is mostly focused on museums and trying to understand the wider evolutionary context of how birdwing butterflies evolved. And then the second part is about the work I've been doing in Sabah, which has taken place in August last year and around this time this year, for which my family and my girlfriend has been able to join me on part of this field trip and help me out a lot.
I think.
So just firstly set the scene. As Dr. Vincent said, it's about a wider context. So we're now in Kota Kinabalu in Sabah, which is of course in Malaysia on the island of Borneo. And it's part of this larger continent, as biogeographers and biologists know it, called Sundaland. And this continent is something that is not really known as a continent today because mostly we think of this area of the world as islands, as a group of islands, a peninsula with an archipelago consisting of the large island of Borneo, and Java, Sumatra, and the Semenanjung. But the lighter blue area between all these places that are now land is actually a shallow continental shelf, and many of you probably know that it's very shallow seas between these islands. And this shallow sea has not been a sea for a long time, because throughout most of evolutionary history, so the millions of years, the tens of millions of years in the past, this area has been a huge landmass, sort of a real continent. And only recently has it become flooded, because this shelf is actually sinking very slowly, and also the global sea level has been changing due to ice ages, which have locked up a lot of the water that is around in the sea in huge patches of ice during the Pleistocene. And this area is a sort of great model for evolution because of this element of islands and continent alternating. So you have a sort of a natural laboratory for species to form. And there's a huge amount of biodiversity here that is unique to this area or unique to a certain island in this area. And the complex climatic, geological, and geographical history that I just mentioned has all contributed to this intricate pattern of species occurring there and here and arising during dynamic periods of history. And that's why it's a very interesting place to study for the evolutionary biologist. And the maps here in the lower part of the slide, they show this continent, and at the top, of course, you see the map as you know it today. So a huge difference between them. So when you come to this place as a biologist, you're confronted by the huge, overwhelming diversity of life that's all around you in the rainforest. And I focus on insects, so I have a few insects here to show you, and these are all things that I photographed, mostly on Mount Kinabalu, to give you an impression of the huge diversity, because quite often you pass by insects and you don't really stop to look at them, but they're so beautiful and so diverse. So you see a lot of moths here, and you see some large beetles, but also non-insects such as spiders, which can also be very beautiful, mole cricket, stick insect, and this is just a tiny portion of this overwhelming diversity. So how to make sense of this diversity and how it has arisen. To do this you need a sort of a model. And as a model, I've chosen to focus on birdwings too. And birdwings are a great model to study evolution, and the first part of this talk I'll tell you why. And hope to convince you that they are a really good thing to study. So I used birdwings to study all these wider patterns in evolution. I hope to convince you why birdwings are a good model group, and also give you a brief introduction on how you study evolutionary relationships in different types of animals and plants, and then give you a sort of a taste of what I found out about birdwings through evolutionary time and geographical space. So why are birdwings a good model group? And one of the reasons is they are widely distributed across Sabah. So you have this continent, and each place from the east to the west, and the north to the south has a birdwing species. And on all these different islands, the birdwings have formed a unique population that is mostly easily recognizable from their wing patterns. So it's a sort of puzzle piece with lots of really easily recognizable parts. You can tell from the look of a birdwing that it's from this island or that island, and then you have many different islands, and this creates a perfect model group for studying their relationships. And what is also great about them is that they've been very popular for a very long time. So from about the mid-18th century, they've been collected a lot by people like Alfred Russel Wallace, which is really a big hero of mine. But people came to this area for a long time, as I'm sure you know, to look for all the diversity in nature here. And there are many people interested in birdwings. Because they had all these different forms, different islands, they're really a collectible item, sort of like postage stamps. And people in the 19th century, they really wanted to have all the different ones, so they built up massive collections. And in any museum, any natural history museum in Europe or here, you'll find a big section of birdwings, which means that you have a time perspective, so you have birdwings from all around collected at different time points, but you also have birdwings from across this whole area because they wanted to get each form. And that means there's a lot of samples that you can incorporate. And this is what I mentioned earlier. So you see here 4 of the main key players that I will be talking about, 4 birdwing species, but in each island they have a different form, and that's indicated by the colors on the map. So, for example, the top left-hand corner is Troides cunifera, which occurs in Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula. But each of these different landmasses has its own form, so you can easily recognize it. Then you have Troides andromache, which we'll be hearing a lot about later, which is only on Borneo, but in different regions of Borneo it has its own form. And then Troides amphrysus occurs all around, but again, everywhere unique, and Miranda on Borneo and Sumatra, 2 different forms. So you have a sort of modular system, which is very important. And now how to find out about all of these evolutionary mysteries? You need to have something to go back in time, and you can use DNA for this. So you all know about DNA. It's inside all of us. It's very important. And you can also use it to retrace evolution. So that's the main thing I'm interested in, retracing evolution. And how to do this, you need to get the DNA out of the birdwings. And this is very difficult actually with the museum specimens, because DNA is a biological molecule. As soon as it's in our body, it's being repaired all the time. It gets damaged by UV, by other things that we incur. But as soon as something dies or a tissue is not living anymore, DNA starts to degrade very rapidly. But if it's quickly dried out, a little bit of DNA still stays inside the specimen, and you can now you can isolate this DNA and then extract the information that you want, because the techniques of isolating DNA are rapidly getting cheaper, but also getting much more efficient. And this is really something that's an exponential process. So sequencing costs are less than half the cost they were probably 5 years ago. So you can really, this resource that I talked about with all of these specimens is really rapidly opening up. And I'll guide you briefly through how I do this sort of. So here in the top left you see my notebook with a butterfly in an envelope. And you see the same butterfly lying there on the picture on the right next to it. And it looks like it was collected, maybe died yesterday, but it actually died more than 100 years ago. So you can see that the outside of the butterfly looks perfect. You can dry out the butterfly and it will stay perfect for very long time. But inside the DNA is being damaged by drying out, by UV, as I said, and by temperature changes. But I have entered into this ancient DNA facility, which is very clean and very sterile, and there I could sort of, with all these different lab techniques, I could extract the DNA in a sort of buffer. So it's sort of like cooking, it's like a recipe. Stephen calls it cookery, my cookery. And in the end, after a very complicated procedure of different steps, I get a sort of tea. So in the bottom right you see two little tubes. One has a little bit of, the left one has a little bit of debris, that's what's left of the leg, and the right one has a sort of tea. And in this tea is the DNA. And I further clean this so that only the molecules that are left are the DNA. And then you have little fragments that you need to piece together, and then you can compare between different specimens, and that's how you find out about their evolution. And it's a very complicated and long process, from all this lab work to all the bioinformatic work that comes afterwards, but then you can really find out a lot about a species or about a population. And this is something this is one of the results so far. So this tree here, this is what's called a tree, an evolutionary tree, and it's sort of like a family tree, except over millions of years. So each tip on this tree is a population. So each text is a population of a different species. And then as you move from right to left, you go back in evolutionary time. So you see the axis on the bottom, it says 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and those are millions of years. So as you go back in time on the different lines on this tree, and then you meet, that is a common ancestor, and when it approximately lived. And you can see with the yellow arrow bars approximately when this was. So that's how to read these things. And I don't want you to spend too much time thinking about this complicated tree, but I'll guide you through the history of these four main species that I showed with the maps earlier. So you have at the top Troides andromache, that's the one from Sabah. Then Troides cunifera, then Troides miranda, and Troides amphrysus. And the first important part in their evolutionary history was around 10 million years ago. And that's a long time ago. And this is the map of 10 million years ago. So you see approximately the distribution of land and sea. And it's not like it is today. Because Borneo actually moved from mainland Asia to the place that it's going now. And at this time was still connected by the land, which is shown in green. There were already some mountains shown in yellow. But what is very important about this picture is that there was a row of volcanoes, and that's the red triangles here. And they connected Borneo with the lands to the east through the Philippines. And the group Birdwings actually originated in the area we know today as the Moluccas, so way to the east in Indonesia, what is now Indonesia. And then they migrated to the west and likely entered Borneo via this chain of volcanoes. So every time that something generally happens in evolution, it is triggered by what is happening around it. So something like this chain of volcanoes would have allowed species to travel through the area and find a new place where there were no birdwings, and then correspondingly occupy all these places in the ecosystem and form species. And that's sort of a central theme. So another point when this occurred, and you can match them up with the timeline there, and then a sort of a burst of junctions in this tree. Another point when this occurred was around 5 to 7 million years ago. And 5 to 7 million years ago, the area around Sunderland looked very different. You see this map is already looking very different. It's looking more like it looks today. There's more land in Java and in Sumatra because these volcanoes are pushing up these areas. Also, a lot of land in Borneo is rising. And most importantly, perhaps, is that the monsoonal climate, the cyclical monsoon that we of course know from this area, is very famous for this area, is starting to intensify. So the land that is there is also changing. There are are drier places, but there are also wetter places. There's a more intense season. So animals and plants that are living here need to cope with that, need to adapt. Again, creating new opportunities for species to focus on and form and occupy that ecological niche. And then most famously, the last part, which is all the little joints at the bottom there, near the 0 million years ago, is the most recent time point actually, within the last million years, and that's the Pleistocene, when all the land and sea was changing rapidly and becoming islands and becoming a land mass again. So disjointing species in geographical space, but also in altitude as the climate shifted from hot to cool, and animals and plants had to move down and up and down mountains. Again, a dynamic point in time. So this is what it looks like. And how the species moved through this area is also quite interesting, and you can retrace this if you know the evolutionary tree and you know their ranges at the moment. Then you can work back in time and estimate the most probable ancestral location. And I know this first part is a lot of detail, and the last part will be less detail. But if you see the color code on the map there, you have Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and Malay Peninsula, and you see the pie charts, then you can see that the size of the color in the pie charts indicates the most likely place where the recent common ancestor of those two forms occurred. And what is very interesting about this is that there were 2 points where it happened, the same thing happened. That birdwings moved from Borneo to Java, so from green to orange, and from orange to blue, and then from blue to yellow. So following the same route through this peninsula. And this was done twice by 2 different species, Troides cunifera and Troides amphrysus. And then the third one that moved westwards was Troides miranda, and that likely moved directly to Sumatra, but we can only paint this picture in light of what we have. So what happens a lot through evolution is that species go extinct, but there's no record of this species. So I can only show you what we currently know, but you have to keep in mind that this is an approximation of the biological truth. And looking back in time is of course never possible. I can also not look back a million years and tell you the exact thing that happened. But this is the most likely scenario for this evolution. And this pattern has been confirmed in many different animals and plants. So there are many plants and animals that are in Borneo and Sumatra and have diversified into different forms, like certain birds or even the clouded leopard. So there are many other cases in evolution that the same pattern has occurred, so that also adds to the credibility of such a hypothesis. Alright, so of this part, I hope that you now know a little bit more about why I would study birdwing butterflies, and that dynamic geological and climatic and geographical circumstances drive speciation and stimulate speciation, and that these birdwings diversified out of Borneo. So Borneo was really the first stepping stone to get into this place called Sundaland, and then from there they have diversified. And Borneo is evolutionarily a very important place because many different animals, as I just mentioned, do this. Just like we have come out of Africa, birdwings have come out of Borneo, at least the Sundaland. So how about the populations on Borneo? And this is where it gets a bit more practical. I will focus in on Troides andromache, which is actually known as the Kinabalu or Borneo birdwing, and only occurs in Sabah. And it's a mountain specialist, occurring only in the mountains of Sabah. And that's the one I focused on for several reasons, which I'll go through now. It's a very interesting species because when you think of this evolutionary story, I mentioned already briefly the mountains and the ice ages, but if you think about the climate now that we have here in Sabah, it's quite hot here. I was sweating a lot before coming here. In the lowlands it's very hot, but up in the mountains it's very cool, and there's all the moss, and it's much more easy for Europeans to sleep there. this layout of hot and cool has not always been the same, because as the global climate changed throughout millions of years of history, this has also changed. So in the ice ages, in the Pleistocene, so about most recently 12,000 years ago, this cool layer would have been way more down the mountain slope. So if you think about the whole Earth was cooler, so there was more ice in the regions of Europe where we live. There was ice on my home actually, but there was no ice here. There was ice on the top of Mount Kinabalu, and all the mossy forest that you normally find on the way up to Kinabalu was way more down. Which means that if it's way down, it means that different hilltops with this mossy forest would have been connected. Now they are isolated. And this is indicated by those two schematic mountains. So the animals and plants that live in these pockets of mossy forest would have been occupying a larger area and be connected. So the theory is that if you have different pockets of mountain now, that the animals and plants that live there would have been connected in the past. And you can retrace this in their DNA. And that's one of the things I want to know. So that's one of the evolutionary reasons for focusing on Troides andromache, because it's only in this mountain mossy forest layer. And I also want to know, how have the two subspecies that occur in Sabah, when have they diverged? So when have they split? Has this also arisen from this change in hot and cold in the tracking of the vegetation down and up? Those are two things I want to find out. And to do this, you need to do a lot of field work, and this is often quite difficult. So I have a video here to show you. This is us, Isabella and I, going to Longpasia, the river, very beautiful there. And here we are at a location. You need to focus on holding a long net. And oh, do you see the butterfly? Yeah. Very quick. And I didn't catch it. So, so it takes a lot of effort to find the birdwings, to find where they are, and then also to catch them, because they're really quick, and you know, they are quite big butterflies. They're like this big, but still it's very difficult to catch them because they're very quick. And as soon as you come up to one, they just dart off into the sky. So they're not your ordinary butterfly just flapping along. Don't know what I'm doing, but as you can easily see, they are really quite a you know, difficult thing to look for. And back in the day, some people went to the extreme of doing a bit more destructive catching. So you can really see this guy. He looks quite shady with his moustache, and that's because he shot it. So this butterfly has 5 bullet wounds. These butterflies are big, so you can just take a shotgun and shoot it from the sky. So that's really quite a shame, because it's it used to be a beautiful butterfly. It doesn't look so brown when it's before shooting it. But that's of course not how we want to do it today. So because of our changing values and our changing attitude towards the natural world, and also because we know that populations are increasingly threatened by things that we do, such as clearing the land or climate change that's now occurring, we need to be more protective of this wildlife, and especially of these birdwings, because they're also quite rare. Some of them are vulnerable because the areas they live in are quite small, but they've also been illegally caught and sold on. So there are many threats to them, and that's why we have taken a less destructive approach to this sort of shooting. So when we finally catch one, this is what happens.
Yes, kami sudah.
So this is a male Troides andromache, recognizable by the white arrows on the forewing and the big yellow hindwing. And we caught it with the net. Actually, I didn't catch this one. Our guy John, who was an excellent butterfly catcher, caught this one. And when we catch it, we go into a sort of very quick process of a short sort of operation. So Isabella is preparing the tools at the moment, and I quickly try to get it out. And you notice me using a blue glove, and that's a lab glove. And that is because I don't want to damage the scales on the wing, but I also don't want to get my own DNA on the butterfly and contaminate my sample. And here are the dots that I was talking about, the white arrows, from which you can recognize the male. Struggling for freedom, which you'll soon get. So we quickly take a little piece of its wing, and this seems, very cruel, but please keep in mind that butterfly wings are non-living material, like hair or nails. So, as far as we know, this shouldn't really hurt them too much. And also, butterflies lose part of their wing surface throughout their life. So when they emerge from the pupae, they are, pristine. But quite often, when you see butterflies, they are already damaged at the wingtips. So they can continue flying and continue their life cycle without this little part. But I can really gain a lot of information from this little sample, because I can look into the DNA and then find out all these different things. So catching the butterfly and taking a little part of its wing and then releasing it back to the wild is really the state-of-the-art way of doing it. And as you see, no damage to the flight capacity of this birdwing, as it happily returns to its forest home in Long Passing. So that's how things go in the field, sort of. And to show you on the map where we've been, this is a picture showing how we take the wingtip. This is a female, by the way, with the white part inside the wing and then the black band around the top. Looks a bit different to the male. Here you see the two of them side by side in the bottom left picture. And we go to these field sites with the boat or with the car and try to catch the butterfly, and it's all really sort of exploring the wild habitats of Sabah. But we also use the museum as a fallback option, because a lot of places are very difficult to reach. When you get there, it takes ages for the butterfly to turn up, and then sometimes you miss it because they're so quick, like in the video. So the red dots are the places where we have been and caught the butterfly, and the orange dots are the museum collection that we use to complement this area to get a good overview. And this is what we did in August. So these different areas, so Lompasia, Cocker Range and Mount Kinabalu. And then this time we've been to these areas as well, where we had some indication that the butterfly may occur. But we didn't manage to find it in Tower Hills, Imbak Canyon, Surinsim, maybe because these places are too low down the mountainside, or maybe because the butterfly doesn't occur there, because this is very difficult to find out. In a closed forest, where you see the huge dipterocarp trees and lianas and everything, it's almost impossible to see the butterfly. You need a clearing, like a river or a sort of open area where butterflies quickly come out of the canopy, and there you can spot it and try to catch it. But they're very secretive creatures. So I hope to now have given you a glimpse of why you would study this species from an evolutionary point of view. And that's because these climate changes have probably influenced their evolution, but finding this out from an insect and a butterfly that is rare and threatened has not been done before, at least not in this region. So it would be very interesting to get these insights. And also, understanding this sort of process is maybe quite important at this point in time, because climate change is, of course, altering this sort of equilibrium between the different vegetational zones and the different places where habitats occur at the moment. So if we can look into the past, then maybe we can know a bit about the future for these species. And as I mentioned, we can use these newest genetic techniques on a tiny bit of wingtip to minimize our impact on the species and still get to know everything we want about them. So then still remains a little bit, why this one? Why not another montane species or another butterfly? And that is because I want to combine scientific research into evolution with conservation. Well, understanding the evolutionary history often is very distant from the practical reality, because I go around Sabah looking for these beautiful birdwings and I see them in museums and they are very beautiful in their own right, but I can see that the landscape is also very different to the time that many of these were collected. Or I can see that land is being cleared, or different things that people do to the landscape all around the world affect these animals and plants. And knowing about their history is very interesting, but we also want to treasure them into the future. And I hope by studying this species I can combine finding out all these interesting evolutionary things with trying to help them survive and persist and trying to keep their populations viable. It's a vulnerable species, so we think that they are doing okay, but they might be, decreasing. There's not much known about them. They're also environmental barometers, so finding out about the butterflies can tell us a little bit more about the wider ecosystem, because they have a tight link to their host plants. The caterpillars eat the plants, and if the plant is not there, the butterfly is not there. And species that are very tightly linked are called specialists, and by studying specialists in this ecosystem, which has a lot of components, you have a very fragile link actually, and if you understand about the fragile link, you are maybe able to understand a little bit more about the wider system around them. And of course, the mountain element means that they are potentially threatened by climate change, because their cool zone of elevation may be shifting up. And as a mountain is a finite entity, and there's not always space to move up. So finding out about the birdwings can also contribute to this. But also the white Kinabalu birdwing, and this is really maybe the most important point of this presentation. The white Kinabalu birdwing is endemic to Sabah. It is only in Sabah. In the whole world, only in Sabah. So it's very special. And the Rotary Club Kota Kinabalu has already been working on this for the last year with Paul and Suzanne and Stephen, of course, and Patrick Vincent is also part of the Rotary Club. And they've been planting Ursolochia vines around different homesteads around Kinabalu in areas that were connected to the forest, but are now partially cultivated and a less suitable home for the birdwing. And when you plant a vine like that, the host plant, the caterpillars can come there and they can eat the host plant and develop into mature butterflies. So you can boost the local population. And this is really working, because here you see a pupae and you see a butterfly, and maybe some of you recognize this butterfly because this is the national butterfly of Malaysia, the Raja Brooks birdwing, which has been feeding on this plant and is now pupated and sitting right over there. And there were 13 pupae on one plant, so really a lot of individuals that wouldn't have been there unless this plant was planted specifically for them and grown in this area. Stephen has also published the only recent publication, for 100+ years on this species, and also working hard on promoting the species for ecotourism, for example, for people to come and visit Sabah and see this beautiful thing, and the other birdwings and other butterflies around them, and also to increase the local awareness of planting the host plant, and so doing this sort of really practical conservation things. And another point is that Sabah is known for its mountains and its biodiversity. Of course, Sabah's flag has the best, or the greatest mountain of Sabah on it, Mount Kinabalu. And all of you, I guess, treasure this mountain. And I've heard a lot of people who really love it, who love going up to the mountain, who love the sight of the mountain. And also, globally, this mountain is a World Heritage Site, of course, with all the different animals and plants that occur on it. And people visit Sabah to see hornbills, to see pitcher plants, or to see orangutans. But insects is not really something that people mention when they visit Sabah, unless they're talking about mosquitoes or something like that. Generally. But insects are a vital part of this ecosystem, of this mountain. And there are many unique insects on this mountain, actually, and they're beautiful. Like I showed in this slide at the beginning, you see all the different insects, all the different colors, the weird forms and shapes, and they play vital roles in the ecosystem, because most species out there are insects, and all these insects are doing different things. They are making sure litter decomposes, or they're making sure different plants stay in check, or pollinating fruits and flowers. So we know that insects are important, but still they are undervalued. And one of the things that you can do to increase the awareness of insects and their importance the knowledge on their importance is to nominate one insect to be sort of the main insect, the insect that stands as an icon for the rest of them. And I think, and a lot of people with me, and several organizations in Sabah have already promoted this and nominated this butterfly, the Kinabalu birdwing, as a state treasure to be the state butterfly of Sabah. And this will be great because then it will become more tangible for people to really find out, oh, this is our state butterfly, where does it occur, what about everything around it? Oh, I see it's state butterfly. It will gain sort of a status and hopefully be more treasured and hopefully be conserved into the future. So I think the butterfly agrees and says, saya ini original Sabahan. Should be with the mountain on the flag, but maybe that's a bit too far. But I really hope it gets through and becomes a state butterfly so that everyone in Sabah can appreciate the beauty of birdwings. And I hope you have enjoyed this presentation and sort of taken away a little bit of this story. Thank you very much for listening.
Now we're going to open the floor for Q&A, so if you guys have any question. Chad, how do you feel about butterfly now?